This is Highside, Lowside, Season 2, Episode 3. It's not that a bike is bad, it's just not good for me. Scene 1 ABC, take 1.
We're talking about... What?
Are you f***ing serious?
Wait, what are we talking about today?
Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla, joined yet again by the gas holes. I got Marquis Spurge, Bolt-On Joe, sitting over here to my left. You're here for another episode of Highside, Lowside, and today we are talking about the good boys of motorcycling. We're talking about whether or not a motorcycle can be bad, or if a motorcycle is just bad for you. And I'm fired up about this.
Oh, we know you're excited, but just
hot to
hold
trot
your
on this.
horses for 1 second. Before we get into that, just keep in mind that for Season 2 of the podcast, we are going beyond the couch in the podcast form. We're going to be interviewing some real key influential people in the motorcycle community, and we're going to be diving into the comments and the feedback that you guys have left for us in Season 1 to answer some of your questions and concerns about everything on two wheels. So,
And to make fun of them sometimes.
well, I mean, we have to make fun of them. You guys spend so much time picking on us, we got to pick on you a little bit. So if you want to just type in RevZilla to wherever you get your podcast, Apple iTunes, or any of the other podcasting apps out there.
All right, gentlemen, let's jump in. Let's do this thing. What are some of the common factors that cause riders to criticize a motorcycle? Note that I have a note for myself in parentheses here. It says, this will be a long one encompassing looks and ergos.
Looks and ergos.
That'll do it.
That sums it up. We can make this a
I
very
think there's
short.
more than just looks and ergos, but yeah, I agree with you there.
So repeat the question again there.
What are some of the common factors that cause riders to criticize a motorcycle?
Usually the price.
Style.
Ooh.
The price is a
like
big
that.
thing because honestly, what happens to me a lot of the time, like I've been riding, I don't know, 30 some years, and I'll look at a bike and know how much it's worth or know how much it costs or whatever, and then I'll go into it with a certain expectation of the experience. And then once I ride it, I'm like, well, that isn't worth that. You know, like I don't feel like that this bike feels like $18,000. You know what I mean? Or on the other hand, you know, like I've ridden cheaper bikes, you know, or less expensive bikes, however you want to say it, and then being like overwhelmed with how cool they are, you know,
bang for
because
the buck factor.
you know, I think for me, like, you know, perceived value versus actual value is very rarely on the same level.
But also,
you're
there's
skipping ahead.
also certain things that people can't afford. So they're like, oh, well, the bike's too expensive. I'm like, is it too expensive, or can you just not afford it?
So is not
That's
the bike is good or good for you.
Yeah.
It's a question of is it too expensive or is it too expensive for
yeah,
you?
and that just makes you angry. So you're like,
Yeah.
oh, this bike sucks because I can't afford it. Like
Right.
that's a different.
But then you wait 2 years and you get a used one. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's half price.
I don't disagree with you. I think there's a lot of things. So again, come back to ergonomics. I think that's kind of an important one. Like I think my gimme putt answer on this is the Harley Sportster. I have never gotten on a Sportster that was not a complete custom and been comfortable in the damn thing. Forwards, mids, I'm just not comfortable on that motorcycle. But it is a phenomenal motorcycle.
Well, I think the
in
other
many
example of
ways.
that was the Indian Scout. Like when you were testing the Indian Scout.
But I did the wrong thing with that bike.
Yeah, you brought it on a 700-mile trip. But no, like when we switched back and forth, and I got on that bike for what, 15 minutes?
We
and I
didn't
was
switch
like,
back and forth. You rode it for 4 seconds and decided you weren't
switched
comfortable.
forth only.
We took a 700-mile trip. I brought my Tiger. Lem brought an Indian Scout, and he was like, "Hey, maybe we switch and we try out the other person's bike." And I was like, "Sure." How bad could this be?
You actually suggested the switch because you
'Cause
saw
I
how
felt bad
miserable I
for
was,
you.
and also I was testing a bike and we had to put a lot of miles on
I
it for
made it
like a weekend.
I made it about 20 miles. No, 20 minutes.
20 minutes, 20
and I was
seconds.
like, all right, we're gonna switch back now. And Lem was like, what? And I'm like, I can't do
But
this.
we know that
Because it was just uncomfortable for me. It just didn't fit me.
well, you guys are abnormally large dudes.
How dare you?
How dare you?
But I mean, you think about the other thing with the Scout. You know, obviously we realized that the suspension was too soft on that bike. You know, it's a little bit of a tight cockpit. But when you think about, man, if they had just spec'd it with a little bit heavier fork springs, like you guys probably would have been.
No, that was not my
happier
issue. My issue was purely the ergonomics on it, like the
I'm
way
with
the mids were,
Spurs,
or the way
dude.
the forward controls were set up, and the way it hit my tailbone and the seat.
I was kinda-
I just wasn't comfortable.
Well, and I
on
was
it.
kind of locked in. I think all of us probably
was
have our
it. It
own
was
spot
locked
that we
in,
want to
yeah.
be in, but
Yeah.
I find personally I can be comfortable for the longest time on something that I can move on a little bit. And,
Yeah.
and that bike, don't get me wrong, like if you like that riding position, it's awesome. It's just like you're stuck in that. Like
Yeah.
there was Spurs took a photo of me actually on that particular bike. I'm standing on the engine cases going down the road just because I'm trying,
trying to
like
stretch his
trying,
legs.
to
Were you
trying to
melting
get a
your
different
boots?
brake.
No, he wasn't.
No.
But I think that's a big thing too. Like I know there's a lot of folks out there that like forward controls. I am not one of them. I like
nope,
mids
right
or
there with
rear
you.
sets, and I'm so
Yeah.
much more comfortable with mids or rear sets than I am.
I think
with,
that has
with
a lot
forward
to do
controls.
with where you spend your time riding too, because forwards are perfectly fine out in the middle of Kansas.
Yep. I was going to say
around Philadelphia, no way.
so great.
But see,
Right,
I've done plenty of cross country trips and stuff, and like I can't do forwards
Yeah, it
for a
puts a
long
lot of
period
weight
of
on
time.
it.
I'm
Like,
generally a mid. I have
makes
one
you
bike
take
with
mids.
forwards, and
Yeah.
like if I had it to do over, like I built the bike, it's all done, whatever. But like if I had it to do over again, I'd probably put mids on.
So I think the other thing that people will slag a bike for that is unrealistic to just criticize it for is style, right?
I was just about to bring this up. I'm glad
Yeah,
you kicked over
so
this.
for me, like the FZ10, when the FZ10 was launched, it's now the MT10 from Yamaha. I loved it. I was like, this bike is phenomenal, and
very
especially
cool bike.
phenomenal for the money. When you looked at all the hyper nakeds that were out there and everything else, and Yamaha brought the bike into the time, I think for like $12,900. It was, thousands of dollars more affordable than, not cheaper, but more affordable than some of the other, expensive, European hyper nakeds out there. And Lance at the time was looking for a motorcycle. And that was years ago, and he's yet to buy a new motorcycle.
Lance is our managing editor.
Yeah, our
of
managing
Common
editor of
Tread,
Common Tread,
our editorial
our
written
magazine.
arm. Yeah. So.
But he was like, I will not ride that bike. And I was like, why? He's like, that is the ugliest bike I have ever seen. And I was like, well, first of all,
You're putting
I
him on
actually
Front
kind of
Street
like
right
the
now.
way well, good. Maybe he'll get off his ass and buy a motorcycle. But like, I think the bike looked cool. I liked the crazy styling. It didn't
Yeah,
bother
it's
me.
really aggressive.
And the bike was fantastic. It was everything he was looking for in a motorcycle, and he refused to even consider it because he was like, I can't look at that thing.
Well, but
which I think is a valid concern, but it
I've
doesn't.
said this
But you can't
before,
slag
and
the bike
I'll say
for
it again, especially in North America, where we don't really rely on our motorcycles as primary transportation. They're not a necessity for most people. I would argue that that's okay. I mean, if the whole job is just to buy a toy to make you happy, well then, yeah, the toy should make you happy.
Lance hasn't owned a car. Lance is one of the rare exceptions where he actually does live on a motorcycle.
But he also has quite a few motorcycles.
Right.
So it's not like he needs another one.
He does because he sold his commuter away, so he like needs to replace it with something. I'm just saying that for me, the style, while it is a consideration, you want the bike to look good. If a bike is just a killer performer, like I can usually look the other way.
Well, that's just it. I think honestly, my perception of a bike's looks overall is always shifted based on my experience riding the bike. Like if I look at a bike, in a magazine or whatever, I'm like, the headlight's weird or whatever. But then I go check it out, or I get an opportunity to ride it, and it sounds rad, or like the instrument panel's really cool, or it's really powerful, or it's fun to ride, or whatever. It's like, oh well, it kind of like the overall vibe shifts a little bit. You know what I mean?
what you just hearing you say that reminded me actually of I noticed something. I was pretty young, probably junior high, when I realized there were maybe sometimes I would meet a gal and I wouldn't think she was that attractive, but then we'd hang out for a little bit, and we'd become friends, and then she would become more attractive. Like sort of that, like I grow to love
funny
it.
how that works.
Yeah, it is very funny how that works.
Did you look exactly like this, just smaller in junior high? Was this like your
I was
look?
big. I've been growing down. I've been growing down. Let's get that out of the way.
I have a question for you, and you can
No,
stop
I
me.
asked the
I know, but
questions.
I have a question for you, and you can stop me if this is going to be
I've
one of your
stopped you.
questions. But Joe actually hit on something, and it goes back to your first question about why certain people like or dislike certain things. He brought up the dash, and we've heard a lot about people talking about analog versus digital dash. Is that one of your questions in there, or should I wait to bring that up?
So it's not one of my questions. However, we may be addressing something like that in the viewer comments section of this episode.
Only available on the podcast.
Right. So if you're watching a video, you'd have to go to the
wow.
podcast for that. So I'm actually gonna
Pause
refute
me.
this. I'm
Pause
sorry.
me.
Yep,
Nope, that's fine.
gotta set that
Very
aside.
nice.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question, which is not about analog dashes. And I think this is hugely important. How much does a rider's experience and well-roundedness as a rider have to do with their interpretation of a given motorcycle?
A lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
we can
Yes.
go.
Yep.
Yeah, I think
Go.
we both agree on that.
Okay,
You want
I-
to go first?
Yeah, I mean, you guys obviously get a little bit more opportunities to ride different press bikes and things like that. But, I got a pretty long riding resume, and I've had a pretty good opportunity to ride a lot of different
Joe
kinds
has
of
had
bikes.
over 3 motorcycles in his life.
Joe's
I
had
think
over
there's
3
6
motorcycles in the
shop right
past
now.
year.
Yeah, well, and I think really without being able to compare it to different styles of bikes or displacements or ergos or even paint jobs, you know what I mean? Like you could really compare all different aspects of bikes from one to the next, and then you kind of figure out what you like, what you want. The thing that I've been finding recently, getting the opportunity to ride to some of our press bikes here and things like that, is that I'll think that I'll hate a bike, and then I'll spend 10 minutes on it and be like, oh, I was completely wrong. Like my interpretation of this bike on paper was so far off until I got to ride it, or the other way around.
I
might
thought
look
this
at
would be great.
Yeah, and I really thought it would be
Right,
fantastic.
and I'm ready for a nap.
Yeah, and then really it's just like, oh, dude, I was really expecting a lot out of this bike, and it's just kind of flat. So
That's one of the biggest things I've learned with working for Common Tread, the magazine side of things, and the bikes we've gotten to review is that like you can look at a spec sheet, and a spec sheet is part of the equation of how you're going to look at it and evaluate a motorcycle, but it only tells such a small portion of the story, because there's been times where I've looked
It's like
at
a baseball
sheet.
card.
Yeah.
It's like the back of a baseball card.
Yeah, where I'm like, oh, these stats look amazing. I can't wait to do it. The biggest thing that I think from a rider's perception is that kind of throws them off on like not liking a bike or liking a bike, and I think it's more of just a misunderstanding. Really comes down to engine characteristics and what they're expecting. I think there's a lot of people out there, and I can do this, so I'll throw my dad under the bus. Spurgeon Sr. I remember when he bought a Suzuki V-Strom, and he was like, "Man, this thing just runs really rough, off, down low. I can't ride it right. I need to fix the fueling and this and that." And I'm like, well, how are you riding it? He's like, "Well, I like to keep it right around 1,800 RPM when I'm cruising." I was like, "Well, you're riding the bike wrong. Like that bike should be, cruising around 45 to 5,000 RPM." And we hear that all the time, where people are like, "Man, this thing just really, it seems like it's lugging." And I'm like, "Well, you're not, like, that's not where you should be riding your bike."
You're lugging it.
And I think that's the biggest thing where people, and you've seen it. It was one of the things we actually talked about in the FTR 1200 review, where you see people transitioning from one type of motorcycle to another, right?
Yeah.
And I think the FTR is a really good experience, is a really good comparison for this, because maybe you have someone that's had an Indian Cruiser or a Cruiser, and they're looking at this and like, "Well, this looks really cool too. I want to try this." That is a bike that you are cruising at 4,500 to 5,000 RPM, and that's where it's comfortable.
Oh yeah.
And if you're coming off of an Indian, a larger, or any of the other cruisers where you can, where you can cruise it around the 2,000 to 2,500 RPM, that's going to seem like you're screaming the engine. But that the red line on that was sky high for a V-twin.
I see that a lot, being involved in the older bikes. Folks would come off of a big twin Harley and then try to ride a British bike, which is half the displacement, and they would short shift it and be like, "Man, this thing has like no power." And an old British twin doesn't come alive until far after a Harley would blow up. You know what I mean? So I think that's a really good point. It's just how it's ridden, how it's designed to be ridden.
I think there's so to your point briefly on that, I think that there's a lot of people who don't expect that they have to sort of modify themselves relative to a bike. Like, you got to ride around the bike. I mean, I think your best racers probably are the best example of that.
I think it's a great way of putting it, is that like you have to understand what the
have
bike
to change
wants to do,
the bike
so
can
you can
change so much because of you, but you
Yes.
have to change so much because of the bike.
I just want to say I love you, Dad. Thank you for raising me.
What a good kid.
The other thing I kind of wanted to bring up too is one of the reasons. So for those of you out there in viewer or listener land, after I get done riding a motorcycle that I'm going to assess, these two are usually the first people I'll go talk to about them. Specifically because
We know more than he does, and he wants us
right,
to.
because I don't know. That's true. But also, aside from that, these guys have a very wide breadth of knowledge. And I say that both in terms of riding disciplines. I mean, these guys ride a lot of different ways, and they also
Side saddle, sometimes backwards.
Sometimes I ride in the passenger seat. Sometimes Joe rides in the passenger seat.
Exactly. No, I mean, from on-road to off-road, you guys really do span a huge gamut of knowledge, and even the stuff maybe that you don't ride, a lot about because you have friends who ride something else. But then also, each of you, when I met you, I was interested in you both personally because you both had what I think most Americans would describe as an inappropriate amount of motorcycles given the number of years you had on the planet. And I'm the same way. Like, I mean, and I've slowed way down since I've had access to all sorts of stuff here. But
I would ask you, what's an inappropriate amount?
I've owned better. I'm in 3 digits now as far as motorcycles I've had my name on. Like, that's a lot for somebody my age, and I think you guys were in the same boat. And then also, you guys had a wide breadth of what you owned. It wasn't just we always kind of peg you as old British bike guy. I think that's where your heart lies. But the reality is, you've had a lot of different stuff over the years.
Well, that's like you, where you get pegged as old Harley guy, and it's like you can walk in your garage and there's everything from dirt bikes to
my
sport
point
bikes.
with this though is that I think it makes us uniquely qualified to assess motorcycles, and I'm tooting my own horn a little bit here, but I will put my prejudices on display. I don't mind I don't mind saying I'm not strong at this, or I prefer this and not that. But I think that experience is such a wide range. It kind of shows you that once you sort of see the whole spectrum, it helps you kind of home in on what you like and what might be good for somebody, even if that somebody is looking for something different than you are.
Is there a question there? Because that just sounds like
No,
you're being
I was
really nice to
responding
us.
to the question.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, there was a question,
thank
and we
you
all
for
responded
that.
to it.
I'm gonna give you a
right.
hug
I just
later.
wanted to be uncharacteristically charitable. For
Yeah,
a
that was
moment.
nice of you.
Okay,
you.
so this will be a fun one. I'm actually really excited about this. Please give a few examples of motorcycles that are wonderful machines that you just don't like, and tell me why.
Please give examples of motorcycles that are wonderful machines that we just don't
Well,
like.
kind of in keeping with the spirit of things, right? Like, it's not that it's not a good motorcycle; it's that it's not a good motorcycle.
Can I
for
talk
me.
about the Versus?
I knew you were gonna, so yeah, go for it.
Go for it, Joe. Take the lead.
So we Kawasaki, very thankfully gave us a nice Versus 1000 LE
SELT plus.
Yeah,
God, get
there's
it
so
together.
many- I don't know.
Don't
It's a-
Kawasaki, please do not give him another bike. He doesn't even care. He can't even learn the name of it.
Right. So obviously, I've had Kawasaki's in the past. I've always loved all of them. Our Ninja 400's really cool. The Z400's really cool.
Now he's plugging them.
yeah,
now
now
I
he's
know
like,
a
"Well, let
lot
me
of the
pat you
names
on the
actually.
back." But listen, when you think about it, like those are like their entry level models, and those are the bikes that I want to ride the most. So this thing is their flagship motorcycle, which came through. It's all big and fancy and has all the bells and whistles that a sport touring bike would have nowadays. And I was anxious to throw a leg over it once it arrived, and then I took it out and sadly kind of not that stoked.
Yeah, but so the juxtapose of that is, how did you feel about it?
So I was just going to say you're wrong. The bike is a phenomenally capable
My
motorcycle.
opinion is wrong.
No, but I think this
yes,
is
I'm
one
teasing.
thing. This is like the perfect example of exactly what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
I thought that was a very wonderful bike, and now I'm actually going to loop you into this because I felt about the Versus, I think the way that you and I felt about the FJR. I think you were significantly more excited about Yamaha's FJR than I was.
I was about to use that as one of my examples of like.
You didn't dig it that much.
I mean, I dug it for what it was. That was a bike that I evaluated in the eyes of like
Yeah,
somebody
the
that was
buyer.
like,
Sure.
45 to 55 that wanted a long haul sport touring bike.
Yeah, you're
that
getting
is a
close
bike,
to my territory. there.
but that's a bike that I would never spend money on.
So I would actually buy one of those motorcycles. And I think actually, oddly, the reason I might buy it was because it didn't make my socks go up and down. That bike wasn't bitchy or hard to start. It didn't have what I think most people would deem personality. It didn't piss fluid all over the garage floor. Like, I stacked a ton of miles. I think I rode that thing
You rode like 5,000, 6,000 miles on that bike?
I think it might have been more than that. I rode a lot of miles on that bike
Well,
in a
I'm-
very short period of time, and it was totally uneventful. Which
It
was,
goes
which
back
is
to-
exactly what it's designed to do.
It kind of goes back to what we talked about first was the cost of it. You know what I mean? For me, if that bike was stripped of all of its fancy stuff, like give me the Versus from a couple years ago.
Or are you going back to the Versus now? Because we've already moved on to the Yamaha FJR.
Well,
so
I didn't ride
you're
the
going
FJR.
you're going back.
But I'm just thinking as far as sport touring bikes in general. You know what I mean? Like for that particular machine, and we talked about how the electronic suspension is really cool for someone who doesn't really get into how suspension works. They don't
Right.
care about learning what preload is or rebound and compression damping and all this stuff. They just want to hit the 2 people button, boop, and the bike rides awesome. That's actually the sound it makes if you listen closely. No, but I just think that for me, it's a lot of dollars for stuff that I don't care too much about. You know?
I think, okay, so there's a couple of things we're talking about here. One, as far as like the Versus and the bells and the whistles and the electronic
We're
suspension.
only talking about one thing.
Well, we're hitting on some different bikes. I thought the Versus was. I'm more probably leaning towards like Lem. Like I don't know if I would go out and buy that particular bike, but the
Not
bells.
for me, but great for somebody.
Yeah, I think
And I
that
can see that. I definitely see that.
I
It's
think
not
that
me.
the electronic suspension works really well for certain applications. I would not want an electronic suspension on a bike that I was ever considering to take off road. I just wouldn't want it.
Right.
I wouldn't mind the electronic suspension on something like the 1290 Adventure S, where it was like the suspension on that was so good that I hit the button. It did everything I wanted to do. It was an active suspension. It was taking my
Let me
inputs
ask
and
you this:
putting it
do
back
you
out.
change your own fork oil?
No.
Incidentally, just for whatever it's worth, kind of coming back to intended use. So that bike was never intended to go off road.
Right.
Great.
Right.
I thought about it. So I actually really liked the electronic suspension. I know you guys didn't, and I had to
No, I didn't have a problem. I didn't have a problem with the electronic
but
suspension
I
on that.
loved it.
Joe did.
And here's why.
Kawasaki's watching.
I have a totally different use case scenario than you guys do. I was riding that to work every single day during the week, and then on the weekend, I'd throw Mrs. Lem on the back and we go take a trip somewhere. Well, man, if you're adjusting your suspension
Yep.
2, 3, 4 times a week, that's a huge pain in the ass.
Yep.
Being able to just hit the 2 riders, 2 suitcases button, that was awesome.
And I guess that's my point. Is I agree with you that for depending on your use, that functionality works really well. Now I see what Joe's saying. If you're doing your own service or if you have to work on that suspension, it gets much more cost prohibitive to do that.
I want to use this though as an example for our audience, kind of bring this back around to our topic. this is so like that bike in this sense, I can demonstrably say that was good. That was a great feature.
Yeah.
It's not good for you. It's not good for you. You guys don't care for that. But for me, the benefits outweighed the drawbacks, and I think it's important for everybody who's assessing a motorcycle, whether it's for own personal use, whether it's for professionally, whether or somewhere in between. It is important to remember that like there's other people who might use stuff in a way different way than you do.
Well, that's where it goes back to the FJR conversation, right? Like, I always liked my sport touring bikes on the sportier side.
Yep.
So, like, my old 99 VFR, which I haven't brought up in a long time, was my perfect sport touring
New
bike.
KTM dirt bike? Can we get one of those in
I
there?
didn't get into that, but I'm going
I
back.
do wish you still had that because
But-
I love them.
So that was my favorite. That was my favorite bike, but it wouldn't be fair for me to compare that sport touring bike to the FJR. I left it out when I was doing the review because the person looking at the FJR wants something a little bit bigger. They want something more comfortable.
Yeah, a
they
little more
want
opulent.
something that they can handle
Probably
longer miles
going
on.
two up, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
and for me, like the VFR was perfect for what I was using it for. So I think that's really what we come back to. The overall topic of there's a bike that's good. It's just not good for me.
Yeah,
It's
I
crazy
agree,
to
I
think
agree.
that his VFR is almost considered a classic at this point.
So
Almost.
99, no, it's 20
it's
years.
beyond
That's-
classic. It's
classic.
It's almost edging
Yeah.
for
I
antique.
thought it was 25. Well, in New Jersey, they say it's 25.
That's for we have
State by
15
state.
and 25 in our state. Okay.
The Keystone
so, this is like I guess a multi-part question.
Yours are always multi-part questions.
Isn't this all kind of hypocritical? So we complain when the machines are bad. We complain when they're too good. We're kind
Is
of
this the royal we, or is this like
no,
the three of us?
motorcycles. Our viewers, our
Motorcycle.
listeners,
So it is the
people
royal
who don't
we
even have a
all.
clue who we are. People who buy a motorcycle. And then, kind of coming back to, and I'm just going to stop on the Versus and the FJR for a minute, because I think that in various ways they both made us feel all the same way, where it's like, okay, capable bike, but it's not doing it for me. Does this sort of relate back to, let's go back to season 1 for a second, does this sort of relate back to, do bikes have soul?
Wait, so what's the question?
Well,
there?
I guess the question, are we being hypocritical in that these motorcycles, we'd complain if it was peeing oil or if it was breaking down, etc. But then we had these bikes, we all rode all these bikes jillions of miles, and they
No
they
problems.
performed flawlessly.
Yeah.
And we're like, I don't really like it. Not
No,
good.
but so I think so as far as that's concerned, fortunately, we've gotten to a point where we just expect that bikes are going to perform and that bikes aren't going to break down, that bikes will continue to just, not piss gasoline or oil all over the garage because honest to God, motorcycles have gotten so good. Like,
Right.
when's the last time, regardless of anything we've thrown our leg over, that I've gotten off of it and been like, well, this really sucked. Like, there might be plenty of bikes out there that aren't for me. There's been plenty of bikes that I've gotten off of, and I've called our press manager, and I've been like, hey, I want to buy this bike. I mean, my last two bikes, aside from the 350, I've bought out of the press fleet because
That's why
I
they keep
loved it so
giving us
much.
bikes, because they were like, oh,
Yeah, I
Spurs
just buy them. We don't have to send them back.
This is the most expensive sales technique the OEMs have undertaken to this date.
But I think that's the biggest thing. We're not being hypocritical because at this point, the base minimum is that the bike is going to be fantastically mechanically sound. From that point on, it's like, what are all these? And that's why it's getting so hard to evaluate and test these bikes, is because from a
They're all
mechanical
really
point of view,
good,
they're all
yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, the brakes aren't, top of the line
He's
race
hedging his
brakes.
bets here, folks. He's hedging his bets. Well, I'd say it was bad, but it's just so wonderful.
They're all so good.
Well,
No,
no,
I
I mean, you touched on soul a little bit, and I obviously I like some older bikes that have a bit of a unique vibe to them and all that, but I really can appreciate, a modern bike that it's super duper reliable, doesn't leak, doesn't act weird. There's nothing, it is
Oh, I
appliance.
can appreciate the hell out of that at this point.
But it's certain features that really surprise me. Again, like when we go back to, on paper, when we were going to get the DCT Africa Twin in, I'm like, well, I want to shift. What the hell? I mean, I don't want to just put it in go and just hit the throttle.
Put it
And
in
then
go? Is that what it is? You
Yeah, it's
park
just
and
go.
the
The go
go.
button.
Right, park
So
and go. That's how
I-
you shift
I
that.
would-
Honda, that's what you
I
need to do
gotta
for the new one. Just have a go button on it.
So I obviously put the thing in drive and just hammer on the throttle, and the thing just bangs through the gears. Like,
Wait, how do you do on the throttle, and then what does it do with the gears? Can you just...
That's the way I type.
Sorry, for those of you who are listening on the
I
podcast.
type like this, and Joe
right.
bangs the throttle.
Joe's showing how the throttle works, and he's
Yeah.
also showing how the tech does windshield wiper. Sorry.
So I was just overwhelmed with how awesome that worked and how it was tunable. You could ride it in standard mode or sport mode or manually shift it. There's different levels of traction control, and it was super intuitive. There's other bikes that I've gotten on where, again, to pick on the Versus, I couldn't figure it out in just a few minutes of sitting on it and going through the menus and stuff.
I could.
The KTM.
So again,
well, I wanted to go back to the DCT for just 1 second. I think that's actually a phenomenal example of what we're talking about. Because I felt the same way you did. I just want to bang my own gears. Whatever.
As soon as I rode it for 10 seconds, I thought it was amazing.
So what's really funny? At the end of 10 seconds, I thought to myself, I was exactly right. I want to bang my own gears. That having been said, that was the most wonderful implementation of a self-shifting motorcycle I could imagine. It wasn't perfect, but it was as close to perfect as I can imagine a self-shifting motorcycle.
Yeah, like a brand new car.
And that was one of those ones too where it's like, well, I want to bang gears, but if you didn't, this is great.
Yeah.
Like,
What impressed me with that was how many people I talked to who I thought after they rode it
would be like,
oh, I just want to go back to the manual. There were so many people that were like, oh, I want this.
Well,
I want the
especially in an
DCT
off-road
version.
situation too. I mean, I think it's think about it's one less thing you have to worry about.
Dude, it was awesome in traffic. It was the only time I didn't hate sitting on a bike in creeping traffic. Coming home from work at rush hour.
Yeah.
Fair. Alrighty, we touched very briefly in question 1 on price. So now the question I have for you guys is, when you are determining the goodness, the relative goodness or badness of a motorcycle, is that an independent characteristic, or is the goodness of a motorcycle and where it falls on your own personal spectrum, is that related to what you have to give up to get it? That is the price. So do you just look at the goodness of a bike and assess on that purely, or do you factor price in? How does that work for
Price is everything, man. If my dirt bike cost $50,000, I would be sorely disappointed. You know what I mean? Obviously,
I think you would still buy it. You love that. And we worked a new KTM dirt bike into the conversation.
But also, I mean, we sometimes talk about the used market too. It's like the used market, or even a leftover bike. You're saving thousands and thousands of dollars right up front. So obviously, like even my Tiger, I got my Tiger. Someone else had traded it in. The dealership serviced it and prepped it. It was beautiful, looked brand new. It had like 5,000 miles on it or whatever. And I saved like $4,000. The thing was already spec'd out with a bunch of aftermarket stuff. So huge bang for the buck. Would I feel the same way about the bike if I had paid MSRP for it and MSRP for all that stuff? Like, maybe I would kind of want some more out of it. You know what I mean? So for me, price is a huge factor.
I think if I am evaluating a bike for Common Tread or for a video review, I will take price into consideration as far as like, this is how much the bike costs. I'm not going to hold a Z400 that costs, under $5,000 to the same standard as something that costs $15,000. Like that's got to be taken into account. For me personally, I look at how good a bike is first. I put price aside.
So it's not unimportant, but you're saying that the bike's
it's
suitability
it's not unimportant.
Right, but the bike's suitability is paramount.
I also own 2 relatively expensive motorcycles right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, Spurgeon Dunbar. Very expensive
Lifestyles of the rich and famous. Hold on a second. I'm going to sip this delicious cocktail. No. But I think that for me, when I was looking at trading in or moving from my Tiger 800 to the 1090, which I bought, it was the fact that like when I rode the 1090, I was like, this is just so much better. Like for what I was, for my intended use, this bike was so much better.
Spurs thinks his bike is cooler than my bike.
No, but I understand that for someone that's maybe looking to do long on-road hauling, or maybe they're
someone
shorter.
Who's real basic at riding.
Well, just tiny. Joe's very short. He's a very short man. He's a tiny boy.
But he's a big head.
Oh, he's very
I need
shiny.
really strong suspension to support my skull.
But I think for me, it was like, okay, this bike really impressed me. I fell in love with it. I loved everything about it. I loved the characteristics of the engine. It was right for me. Then I looked at the price tag. I was like, you know what? That seems fair.
How bad could that price tag have been before you'd have been like, oh, I'm out?
I think...
Like, would you have paid more for that bike?
I think the price fit perfectly. If that bike was $2,000 or $3,000 more, I probably would have been like, I'll wait. But I think that...
And if it was $2,000 or $3,000 less, you'd have been in love with it.
I was in love with it for about what I got it for.
So if you gotten less, you'd been like madly in love with it.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm just asking. Yeah. I'm serious. I just don't usually approach stuff that way. That's why
I saved a couple grand buying my dirt bike as a leftover, and that really
What kind of dirt bike is that again?
It's an orange one.
And did you get it used?
No, but it was leftover, and for me, I think that really really made me feel a lot better about it once I started riding it off road and realized how good it is and everything. But there were some issues with the fueling and everything that I had to deal with, and obviously every off road bike, if you're really competitive on, I've been racing it, it takes some time to set it up and get everything figured out. But the fact that I saved a couple grand up front really, really made me feel like the value of the bike was worth having to mess with a little bit, things like that. Now, if I had paid top dollar for it, again, like the Tiger, I think I would have had higher expectations. I might have been more disappointed about having to, mess with the carburetor and all that stuff.
So touching on the dirt bike aspect of it, like, I don't mind, like, KTM's coming at a premium cost, especially let's put the adventure bike aside, because I do think that some of their adventure bikes with all the rebates and shit that they have on them get very competitive from a pricing standpoint. But looking at their dirt bikes, like, when you're looking at like a WR250 for like $6,500, or you're looking at a KTM for $10,500, I think you really have to ask yourself what you want to do. And if you're just looking to go out for a trail ride, that $6,500 bike is probably much more attractive.
Yeah.
But for me, like, I was looking at being more competitive.
Race. Yeah, exactly.
And the KTM already comes with a lot of the competitive features that I'd be looking for from a performance standpoint.
Honestly, right now, it sounds like you're just cementing the point you made earlier, which is, I'm going to do this thing. I want a bike that needs to do this stuff.
I want to buy the bike that's right for what I want to do.
I got to pay
I think the hardest thing for our viewers or listeners or, and just riders in general to figure out is, like, what is going to be your intended use?
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, some guy might, look at a TW or an XT or, kind of like generic, like, kind of a cheap little bike, and think, oh man, I'm just going to bop around the fishing hole and take it to the campground and stuff like that. And then he's just like, oh, you know what, man, I really want to, like, try this gnarly rocky climb or this big downhill, or I'm going to do a hair scramble on it. And then he's like, oh my God, the thing's falling apart, or I'm crashing all over the place because the suspension's
I don't think it'd fall apart, but I think you probably wouldn't be coming in first place.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So it's like, I think the toughest thing for everyone out there trying to shop for a new motorcycle or even a used one is to try to figure out what is going to be their intended use. Like, where do they see themselves in a couple years? A lot of folks have a bike for maybe 5 years or so.
I think that the recommendation I would make is, I would say, start off lower than what you think you're going to do, realize that you want to do more with it, and then make the upgrade. Because I think so many times what you see people do is they look at the magazine pictures, or they look at and they're like, oh, I'm going to go do that. So they buy their bike and they put, regardless of the segment, but the adventure segment just comes to mind because they buy the big bike, they put the knobby tires on it, they put all the crash protection on, and then they drive, maybe 2,000 miles a year going, back and forth to work. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but maybe then you bought too much bike in the other direction. You could have saved a few dollars. You could have gotten something that was more street focused and maybe gotten a more appropriate motorcycle for yourself.
I think, so it's interesting. How I feel personally and what I do professionally and what everybody else does are actually three different things, I think, for me.
I agree with that. Yeah.
I think about my own garage, and I have some motorcycles that on paper are phenomenally terrible. I mean, really awful.
I've seen them. They look phenomenally terrible.
Right,
they
perform
phenomenally terrible.
And they were incredibly expensive to acquire.
And you love them.
Yes, and I don't think that most people do that. I think most people are actually the other way around. I think so if I'm shopping for a new bike now, I'm looking for a bike that is bang for the buck centric. Like, I want a lot of performance. I don't want to pay anything for it because I already got a bunch of money tied up in bikes that do awfully. I think most people are actually kind of bass backward from that. They buy a good bike and then they're like, okay, well, as a second bike, I can put up with some bad behavior because I have a good running bike that is my daily.
It goes back to where your priorities are, right? Like, your priorities are like you get a kick out of the vintage, shopper type segment.
The other thing that I think, though, that sort of throws me for a loop, I'm thinking specifically of two bikes that I reviewed now in the professional sense, and I am using air quotes. I use that term very loosely. I'm thinking specifically of the Harley Livewire and the Modus MSTR, the now defunct Modus. Phenomenal motorcycles. I mean, phenomenal. These were just so much fun. Not qualified good, not good for an electric or good for a small manufacturer. Right. I mean, just awesome motorcycles. That having been said, I think in each of these reviews I did mention 30 grand. Like, this is $30,000. Like, that is a barrier to entry that is super high. It doesn't matter
considering
how
many really awesome cars you could get for that or less.
Well, but just how many how many used pedestrian bikes could you get for that kind of money? I mean, I think that's it. You do have to take that into account. It's a real thing.
Right. So you're this is actually really interesting. So for someone that's watching this,
Well, we're trying to make a show that's interesting, so it's
no,
good.
but I think for someone that's watching this, there are plenty of people out there that are probably watching this thinking, man, like, $5,000 for a new Z400 is probably as much as I can go. And I'm sitting here talking about buying a 1090 for 15 grand. They're probably like, well, 15 grand, like I can't, like, that's
it's all
crazy.
relative.
But then there's somebody out there that's watching this, that's sitting there in their, estate, and they're like, well, $30,000 for another toy in the garage.
Oh, you're talking somebody out. You're talking about somebody out
Let
on.
me invite you over to my house.
You're talking about somebody out on Dunbar Manor.
in Dunbar Manor.
Alrighty, so we've covered the fact that all motorcycles are wonderful. That is correct. Secondly, Spurgeon is very, very wealthy.
I didn't know that about myself. I've learned something
we've
about
really
myself
nailed
today.
that down. And the Highside Lowside crew does, of course, enjoy buying new orange dirt bikes.
Well, in
That's-
fairness, you've got some fancy Italian dirt bikes that you bought too. You're just
I
pointing
don't-
the finger at
I
us.
don't have any dirt bikes anymore.
Yeah, because you just sold it.
There you go. Alrighty, I think that should wrap it up. I'm so sorry you people had to witness
No.
this.
There are certain people out there that want more. And just keep in mind that if you do want more, there is the extended podcast version. We dive into your comments. We've got some great interviews with Chris Fillmore, Ryan from Fort 9, as well as other key figures in the motorcycle industry. Just type in RevZilla to Apple iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. You're like my flashy
I
fingers
love
there.
you got spirit fingers there. I think that's gonna do it for us. For the gas holes, I'm Lem. We're out of here.